Hello everyone. Welcome to today's Author Circle event. My name is Jerry Howard, and I'm on the board of this lovely library. I was thinking that the weather's just perfect for this because it's really nice enough to get you out of the house, but not so nice that you want to stay out there instead of come in here. So the weather gods are kind. Today, we're lucky to have the author and activist, Tony Hiss, to talk to us about his book, Rescuing the Planet, Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth. No less an authority than the very, very great biologist E.L. Wilson calls it a dazzling blend of science, travelogue, and history, written in erudite yet pleasingly conversational prose. And I hope we can get Ed Wilson out on the table just for a bit, because he's an animating spirit of this book. Maybe a little surprisingly to me, the Wall Street Journal also liked the book, called it inspiring and upbeat and engaging account of the remarkable progress being made to preserve vast wild spaces for animals to roam. Tony Hiss is the author of 15 books, and he's been a staff writer for 30 years at the New Yorker. We're really lucky to have as our co-conversationalist here our esteemed Tuxedo Park neighbor, Christopher Gow. I asked Christopher to do this to bring some actual horticultural and natural expertise to the proceedings, something I lack. He also has a record of actual accomplishment in the area of preservation, of course, as one of the prime movers of the gloriously restored racetrack in the park, which now looks like what it sort of did once upon a time, and not like the Orange County annex of the Jersey Meadowlands. So and he is the head of the tree committee at Tuxedo Park as well. So first things first, books are for sale, and Tony will be glad to sign them for you after the event. The conversation that we'll have will go on for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we will have time for 10 or 15 minutes of questions. This event is being viewed on Zoom, and so I will say to the people on Zoom, if you folks have questions, just put them into the chat function, and Diane Loomis will bring them over so you too can be part of the conversation. So so much for the preliminaries. I'll start with the question, and we'll take it from there. So Rescuing the Planet, it's a book animated by a big idea, or as you or somebody else put it, a BHAG, a big, hairy, ambitious goal, buttressed by and illustrated with almost literally a continent and a planet's worth of example. So I'm just going to give you a chance to lay out for us your 50 by 50 program, what it is, and why it is, to your mind, and not your mind alone, of course, urgently necessary and totally practical. So take it away.
Thank you, Jerry, and I'm so thrilled and honored to be here with you and with Christopher in this beautiful library, in this beautiful town of Tuxedo. This is an issue that people are just beginning to catch up with. It's been urgent for a long time, but because 196 countries gathered in Montreal in December and decided the only way to protect a million species of plants and animals from going extinct in the next few years was to protect at least 30% of the land and water of the planet by the year 2030 as a stepping stone to protecting 50% by 2050, suddenly it became news, and which is great because the book has actually been out for a couple of years, and now it's finally finding its place. So the concept is, it's the other part of what used to be called the other calamity. We've talked about climate change for a number of years. And in a funny way, that was easier to talk about because it was things that were going wrong. It was the temperature, or it was pollution, or it was gases in the air. Whereas now we're talking about living creatures. And some of this goes back 100 years. I was introduced in researching this book to a man named Vladimir Jovanovich Vernadsky. And I wish I could show you a picture of his piercing gaze, which sort of pins you to the spot. And he is equally revered in Ukraine and in Russia as the great scientist of the 20th century. There are subway stations in Moscow named for him. There's a crater on the dark side of the moon named for him. But very few people over here have heard of him. So, but in 1925, he wrote the sort of first biography of the biosphere, that is, that zone of life circling the planet, biosphere, as he called it. And one of the things we're sort of gradually living to learn is that it isn't so much that we live on Earth as we live within this life zone, the biosphere. Because not only is there life around us as we, but there is life above us and life below us. And it's called the biosphere, but in fact, it's not a sphere at all. It's just this thin band of living stuff around the Earth. And it's ancient and it's resilient and it's bountiful, but as we're beginning to learn, it's also quite vulnerable because it's very thin. Most species that we know of live between the summit of Mount Everest and the bottom of the Mariana Trench of the Pacific Ocean. And that is a distance of 12.5 miles, which if laid out horizontally, as someone pointed out, is a distance you could drive across easily in about 20 minutes. So we have to get used to the idea that this place has built-in vulnerability. The other thing we're getting used to is the idea of all this life around us. It isn't just inert, and it isn't just sort of vegetative. In fact, the word vegetative doesn't seem to quite make sense anymore, because so much of this life we're learning is imbued with intelligence, and it's imbued with feeling. Just last summer, a German scientist wrote a book about bees, in which he demonstrated that a bee whose brain is the size of a poppy seed has a rich inner life. So we are surrounded by a vast sea of sentience. There is life everywhere. There is awareness, there is intelligence, there is feeling. The implication of that, which is new to us too, is that there really is no such thing as a piece of vacant land or an empty lot. It may not have our purposes on it, but it has life within it. And if we need to do something that makes sense to us, we have to now take more care that it also makes sense to the creatures that are already there. So one of the challenges ahead of us is what I've started calling all species design. How can we introduce our purposes in ways that don't interfere with the needs of others? And this is a wonderful town to talk about this in, because that was one of the founding principles of the village of Tuxedo Park, that you could make sense out of adding people to the landscape without detracting from the gorgeousness of the landscape. And also, this is an extraordinarily biodiverse place, not only in the books that have been written about Tuxedo Park, but also some surveys done along the Appalachian Trail, which runs through the very north end of town. Wildly biodiverse in terms of plants and animals and birds, and of course, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but now we're realizing that not only is the town of great importance, but the whole Highlands region is of great importance, and has been for many years, for many thousands of years, because migrating birds need it to guide them north every spring and south every fall. So that's a roundabout way of saying that this is an incredibly urgent situation and something we can do something about. The other thing that I found out traveling around North America when I was writing this book is how many people have heard this in their minds and hearts and are doing things, prompted just by the feeling that there's something I can do wherever I am to make things different. And I found all kinds of people who hadn't been pushed into doing it, who just started doing it all over the place. And many of them never heard of the next guy, but they're doing it anyway.
You're absolutely right. And this is what you wrote in the book. It's, I can't resist saying this, it's his story, making history, but it's our story. It really is. And Tony really got across, if you haven't read the book yet, he really got across the importance about the environment. I mean, hands up, who loves and thinks the environment is important? I mean, everybody, yeah. So we all have to do our part. And as Tony said, we're ahead of the game a little bit in where we are, because we started off on the right foot here in Tuxedo Park. We're surrounded by the Harriman Forest State Park, 44,000 square acres of state park. We have Sterling Forest on the other side, which is things like 22,000 acres in growing. And we have here in the town, we have a native pollinator meadow just up the road on Route 17. In the village, we have the Tuxedo Park Racetrack Nature Preserve. It was a restoration project of a abandoned racetrack, and and so
that was your doing.
Well, no, it was John Irizarry, the late John Irizarry. Dina Steele, is Dina here today? Dina Steele was very involved with that. Dina Steele was like it was the twinkle in her eye. She gave birth to it, and I'm like a wet nurse. I'm keeping it growing and nourishing.
I'll never think of you the same.
Protecting it from invasive species. And so yeah, we're ahead of the game. But here's a question I want to ask you. That here's a bottle of water. Now, which of you see this bottle as half full, and which of you see it as half empty? So half full, put your hands up. And half empty. So there's optimists and pessimists. And so in all of this, after reading Tony's book, I got this sense that you, even though we have this big problem on our hands, you're optimistic about it. Is that the case?
Tremendously optimistic. We're all lucky to be alive at this time when we're needed and with still a chance to do something of great positivity. I should talk a little bit more about this whole 50% idea, which could be a bugaboo. The idea is, as Jerry said, it's this big, hairy, audacious goal. Field studies of the needs of plants and animals show that most species, by and large, split the difference, need about at least half of their original habitat still available to them in order to thrive. It varies, some need less than that, some need more than that. But also we can begin to, there's sort of predictive biology now, which says that if we go along the way we're going now, the way we're consuming land for human purposes, probably in another few decades, only about 25% of the species we're co-inhabiting with will survive. But if we bump that up to 50%, at least 85 to 90% can survive. Not everything, but at least almost everything. So it's a huge challenge because North America is now about 15% protected land. And it took us 150 years to get there. Yellowstone National Park was started in 1872, the first national park anywhere in the world. Okay, so we got from 0 to 15% in 150 years. Now they're saying we have to go to at least double that in the 20s, but it's already 2023. It's the world's shortest decade. And then that's just a first step to going towards 50% by mid-century. So it's also a question of, it isn't that some places are bad and some places are good. If we protect even 30%, there's one of the people I've been talking to says it's 30 plus 70. The other 70, you can't just write off. The 30 can only continue to exist in good shape if we think about the 72. So if we're thinking about everywhere, and I'm sorry, Jerry, I have to put in a good word for the Meadowlands. A lot of good things are actually happening in the Meadowlands these days. And that's an extraordinary expanse of.
No, I apologize to all you Meadowlands fans. When I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, we would drive through New Jersey, and there are so many vivid words I could use to describe the smell. But it is a success story. It's just that we don't have phragmites in the racetrack as we used to. Yeah, I know you acknowledge Robert Sullivan in your book, who wrote
Yes.
just a first-rate book about
Beautiful
the
book.
Meadowlands. Yeah.
So Jerry said I was lucky enough to be befriended by E.O. Wilson, the late great Harvard biologist and godfather of biodiversity, as many people call him. And for some reason, he took a liking to me and began to introduce me to people. One of whom was one of these amazing people who just decided to jump into the biodiversity game. A guy from the commodities trader from the panhandle of Florida named M.C. Davis, who knew nothing and cared very little about the environment most of his life until he was caught in a traffic jam one day on I-4 in Florida. Was so fed up that he looked to one side and the other and saw a billboard on a local high school that said Black Bear Seminar. He said, anything's better than this. So he peeled off, went inside, big room. He said, a couple of lost Canadians, a couple of people sort of hoping for free donuts. And up on the stage, two women who were talking about the needs of Florida black bears, of subspecies of black bear, and how their native habitat was something called the longleaf pine forest, which had been the signature ecosystem of that part of the world until after the Civil War, when it started getting chopped down. And in fact, they're finding timbers of old loft buildings in New York now, which are these beautiful longleaf pine timbers. But it's the reason Scarlett O'Hara never went hungry again, because she started chopping down all the trees after the plantation went bust after the end of the war. So MC the next day sent these two ladies a check to cover their expenses for 2 years, and then went and talked to them, and they looked a little nervously at him and thought, what's happening now? And he said, I do need something from you. I need a list of the 100 most important environmental books. I'm way behind. Please help me out. He spent the next year reading these books. And then, inspired, he went and bought 51,000 acres of clapped out peanut farms and started regrowing longleaf pine forest on them. When I met him, it was what, year 13 of his project? And it looked pretty scruffy to me, but he said, come back in another 287 years. And you'll see something real. And MC unfortunately is gone from us now, but he endowed the project. So there will be enough to carry it forward for at least 300 years.
That's the great thing about your book. It's filled with all these anecdotes about what inspired people and what one can do oneself. There's another one I'd love you to talk about, is a lady, Anna Vela Clark, and her rocks. And she dealt with something that we're dealing with here in Tuxedo Park, that we're very privileged to have a lake, which is not only a lake, it's a reservoir, it's our drinking water. So it's something we have this double-edged sword, this benefit of having both, and that's quite rare. So we have to protect it. And so riparian buffers are so important. We really have to make sure what we do doesn't impinge negatively on this, but positively. And so tell us the story about Anna Vela Clark and her rocks.
Another story that sounds very unlikely. She was a New York artist and bought an incredibly dry piece of property in Arizona, now has some just south of the border in Mexico. Water was long gone. Cattle had cropped what vegetation was left, and that now was just barren. But she had working for her some Mexicans who had come north from a place where the tradition was they knew how to work stones and fit them together without mortar. And she found that the one place on her property that had a little bit of water flowing, if they just threw a few rocks around it, suddenly there was more water because it wasn't just leaking away. So she asked these Mexican helpers to start putting rocks around all the places that occasionally got some water. And suddenly she was re-greening this landscape. She couldn't have done it by herself. The Mexicans wouldn't have thought to do it unless she'd said, please do this. And now Lois and I went down there and it's incredible. You can see these brown hills, and in between are these huge ribbons of green along the stream beds that she's restored, and not only restored the greenery, but the bird life and the wildlife as well. So again, a story that just sort of came out of need and but out of nowhere. And I was finding this all over the continent. And we're very lucky here in North America, by the way, because the continent has sort of good bones. Not only do we have in the east the Appalachian mountain range, the highlands of which are an important part of which, but it's parallel to the west by the Rockies. So you've got these two parallel north-south running mountain ranges. Across the top, you've got one of the most extraordinary landscapes in the world, and perhaps the most intact one, the so-called boreal forest, which stretches from Alaska all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. 1,000 miles from north to south, 3 or 4 or 5,000 miles long, and almost completely still the way it always was. What the frontier used to be like, what we thought had disappeared forever. We thought that because we went from east to west, but instead, if we'd gone from south to north, we would have seen it still there, still largely without roads, but still with, unlike with the US, the Canadians, although they were beastly to their indigenous inhabitants, never kicked them off the land. And now the Canadians are turning to these people and saying, we need you. We want you to be in charge of a whole new second national park system of Canada, in which you will be the guardians, the mucklucks and boots, the mucklucks and moccasins on the ground instead of boots on the ground. And that's going to help Canada reach its goal of 30 by 30, because this entire parallel park system that will be staffed by Indigenous people is coming into being. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening here in North America. And that's sort of a level at which I find it's useful to think. Speaking of the Appalachians, another amazing person in this book that I got to know historically, in the summer of 1900, a young college graduate celebrated with a friend by bushwhacking up Stratton Mountain in the Green Mountains of Vermont. No trails in those days. Climbed to the top of the peak, shinnied up the tallest trees they could find, swaying there, looking out over the hills. He had this sudden sense that he was in a single place that stretched all the way from Maine down to Georgia, along the length of the Appalachian Mountains. This was Benton Mackay, who 21 years later came up with the idea for the Appalachian Trail, a trail running the length of the Appalachian Mountains from Maine to Georgia and through the highlands, of course. And this caught people's imaginations. So, as he said, I suddenly was overcome by this planetary feeling that within 12 years, the Appalachian Trail had come into being. And almost entirely it was constructed by people volunteering their time on weekends. It is probably the largest single piece of public works ever constructed by volunteers. And it's there to this day. So here we are talking about protecting great swaths of land. And here comes the extraordinary story of what's happening and has happened right here. We know the story of how Tuxedo Village came into being because Lorillard in 1866, was it? 86.
86.
Forced his architect,
Bruce Price.
who built this beautiful building we're in today, forced him to get off a train in the middle of a blinding rainstorm and trudge up the hills, found this land and said, this is where we're going to make the village. Hired 1,800 Italians and Hungarians, and in the course of the next 8 months, carved out the roads and trails of the village. An imperious, impetuous man, Lorillard, would say to Price things like, okay, well, let's have 2 more cottages here. No, let's make it 4 cottages. I want the plans tomorrow and I want them started on by Monday. Yes, sir, Mr. Lorillard. At the same time, the Harriman family was buying up enormous pieces of land, both to the north of Tuxedo and to the west of it. Harriman was the railroad king, was known as one of the most disagreeable men of his day, but he also decided it was a landscape that had to be protected. In 1906, I think it was, the state of New York decided for some cockamamie reason that the Sing Sing prison should be relocated up the Hudson to Bear Mountain. And they took 750 acres and began building the new Sing Sing. Harriman was outraged, decided to do something about it, died in 1908, but his widow, Mary Harriman, offered the state 10,000 acres of land as public park land with $1 million endowment if they would stop building the prison. The state thought that was a pretty good deal. She also offered to raise another $1.5 million if the state would match the $2.5 million. So then you have Harriman State Park, Bear Mountain State Park. Here is this, as Christopher was saying, to the north, this extraordinary open land. Then the Harrimans are also responsible for the Sterling Forest story, but that's because they sold the land in the 50s to a development company, which never got that far. But in 1986, because there were now a public presence, a hiker from New York City named Joanne Dolan heard about the development plans and decided this could not stand. And partly it was because she just had a baby boy who had Down syndrome. But when she took him outside into the woods, his face lit up and the light came back into his eyes. So she said, this place must be protected. So she teamed up with Bob Benoist, the head of the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, and they formed this public-private partnership, which when the development plans for a town of 35 to 40,000 people and 8 million square feet of light industrial or commercial space was proposed, they were somehow able to raise $55 million of federal, state, and foundation money to protect Sterling Forest. And it's because of those 2 anchors that the town of Tuxedo now finds itself in the odd position. Talk about 50 by 50, you guys are so far ahead of the curve. 78.9% of the town of Tuxedo is permanently protected open space.
Well, how do we get back down to 50?
You don't, but
We can sell off some of our percentage to the others.
but you have this new plan for development of Tuxedo Farms, which I find fascinating because I think you're trying to do something that very few towns have done, which is to fill in a way that is respectful of the place.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's kind of like one step backwards because it was a whole swathe of land that was deforested where there's going to be development. But when I saw the planting plan that they put forward, Jay O'Reilly, one of our council people in the town, shared with me the planting plan that related company have done. I have never seen such an amazing document of native plants, page after page after page of all the recommendations, what future homeowners can plant on their property. And native species, if those that you don't know, are so important because they're team players. Like here at the library, there's a great team, they all work together and produce something wonderful. If they were just cast from, central casting and just looking pretty and just sitting there, but not communicating, not working well, it wouldn't function. They work together well. Native plants work together well. That's why they're so much more important than exotic plants, which just there in your garden sit pretty. So it's this this working together. And so the Related Farms project, yeah, it's maybe one step back, but it is promising.
But it's in other ways a step forward, because the whole concept now of the so-called missing middle of kind of housing that the town has made related, decide is the central part of what they will build, it is units that are somehow in between single-family homes off by themselves and 6 or 10-story apartment buildings. There's a whole range of kinds of places people actually prefer to live in, which are slightly more densely developed than single-family homes, but don't seem to be that way because they're so artfully arranged and are much more affordable in the landscape. So this, I find, a really exciting development. What does it, you guys are living the future we're trying to contend with. What does a town that is 79% protected do to make it possible for people to live here and earn a living here and keep town services going?
Tony, I wanted to get you to talk about something that you term life at the half-Earth interface, which concerns how animals and humans can get along. There's a fascinating story in the book about a wolf. His name is Pluie, who is a pretty damn important wolf because he was one of the first wolves who was wired, and GPS was used to track. It's a she, actually, isn't it? A she.
It is a she. It was
a she wolf to track her domain, and the domain of this wolf, which was out in the Yellowstone area, was so much vaster than anybody ever knew. It took in hundreds of thousands of acres, and as a result of this, wolves, which were tending toward extinction, I think you would say, are now back in the West. But this raises issues. I mean, some people may not want to have wolves in their backyard, especially ranchers. Some people may not want to have bears in their backyard. We've had bears in our backyard. It's a startling thing, really. So I think I would like to ask you to talk about the friction and the trade-offs and the ways that as we try to restore parts of world to their something like their former natural state, that the people who are at that interface between nature and human habitation, what do you have to do to make it viable?
Well, Jerry, you're right. It's not automatic.
Yeah.
And I think for a long time, it was sort of the American dream for there to be no interface. We cleared the land of varmints in order to feel comfortable and safe. But we were kidding ourselves because they wanted to be here. As you said, the wolf Pluie was a Canadian wolf that was caught near Banff National Park in 1991, was it? And as you said, banded, and one of the first that you could retrieve signals from the collar through GPS. We didn't know really where they went. It was expected. She was called Pluie because it was blinding rainstorm the day she was collared. Pluie in French rain. They thought, well, she probably traveled 50 to 60 miles. We knew they moved around a bit, and she did that for a while. But then the collar went dead, and they thought, oh well, that's science for you, you know. Until several months later, someone from NASA called up and said, "We've got your wolf is being tracked, and he's down here in Idaho."
Well, Canadians love to come south, especially in the winter.
That's what it was. And the wolf, over the next year and a half, made this vast round circuit, as Jerry was saying, through 3 US states and 2 Canadian provinces. Enormous. And moved so quick that, as one of the scientists said, we thought she was on a pickup truck. So we're just catching up to the reality of what's happening.
That's fascinating, because that leads to another part in your book about these corridors. We have these amazing, healthy places of where, you know, nature is thriving, and the biodiversity is flourishing. And then there's another pocket over here. So tell us about these corridors, how important
Well,
they
now
are.
we're sort of finding that some of these animals just do this. Wolves roam and wander, but the things they eat tend to migrate annually along corridors. The mule deer and all the other hoofed animals of the West. What is it? They surf the green wave. That's what it's called. As the spring comes, they love the tender green first shoots, and they go north following the greening. And we never knew what these routes were, going along thousands of years right under our eyes, and we're just catching up with them now that we can band them. Well, up in Canada, Banff National Park is bisected by a transcontinental highway, just as this valley through the highlands is bisected by the Thruway and Route 17. Well, along 55 miles, they've now created 48 either animal overpasses or animal underpasses to reconnect this landscape. It turns out that the whole building of the interstate highway system was a way of vastly fencing off the landscape. We never realized what an obstacle that was. There's some talk now about building at least one crossing of the Thruway.
Yeah, I wondered that.
This area.
immediately, yeah.
The
It's
open
kind of a
space.
killing field right now.
The Open Space Institute is talking about that.
It's a good idea.
So you're doing it's a bridge, but not for pedestrians or for cars. It's a bridge for wildlife.
Only for wildlife. And it's planted. And some animals are cautious. Takes a while for them to get used. Others scamper right across it. Also, the culverts underneath can become animal trackways too. Some prefer to go under, some prefer to go over. There's a whole history and science of this now, after 20 years of doing this.
Well, it's fascinating because there's the entomologist Doug Tallamy, who's written a lot of good ecological books, and he talks about, you know, what we can do in our own backyard in linking our own backyards, making our own backyards healthier, to support more native, more biodiversity. And so if we all just do that little incremental effort in our own backyards, but the cumulative effect is powerful. I think in your book you talk about 1 + 1 + 1 = 4, and that if we do that, and there's these corridors, these links for the wildlife to be able to survive and get from one safe haven to another. So I think
Doug Tallamy, I think his term is homegrown national park.
that's great. Yes.
And the pollinator pathways. If you can take a tiny piece of your lawn, and it turns out that lawns are the 3rd largest crop grown in America, right after corn and wheat. Millions and millions of acres, and they're sterile in terms of biodiversity. But if you can take a little piece of your lawn and put it back to native plantings that will attract bees and butterflies. They can hop from your lawn to somebody else's lawn and keep going. That's why they're called pollinator pathways. And a tiny thing can become something big, as you said.
And we talked about Edward Wilson before, and in the introduction to your book, he was saying there's three crises. There's the climate change, there's the shortage of fresh water, and decreased biodiversity. So which, in your opinion, how do you rank those?
Okay, I'll take a stand. I think biodiversity is at the bottom of all of this. Because it isn't just 1 million species that are at risk, it's 1,000,001, the one being us. We depend for the food we eat on these vast systems of living things. We depend for the air we breathe on these vast systems of living things. If we can't keep them going, they're not going to be able to keep us going. So yes, the other things are incredibly important, but it's all in the purpose of keeping everything. Let's keep life alive. That's the way we have to go. And we're just beginning to catch up with this. And it does seem so much harder than to just think about stopping polluting something, even though that's hard enough. And we're just realizing that we're doing so many things at once, we haven't quite put them all together. Now we're trying to transition to a green economy, but we're told the green economy needs all kinds of rare earths to power the batteries. So that means we have to start mining again. Well, for the last 30 years or so, we've reinvented surgery so that a lot of surgery can be done just by poking a tube inside someone, laparoscopic, endoscopic surgery, rather than just cutting them open and digging inside. We need to begin to think of low impact mining, minimal impact mining. So much needs to be reinvented to get this done, but we can do it.
You're right, it's a compromise. I think that's the winning scenario, that we can't be absolute purists and yes, we can shoot for the stars and reach the moon, or is it the other way around? but we can try and try. But if we come to a compromise, then I think that's the winning scenario. Now, one of your chapters, I love the title. It's called "All of Life Inside and Nowhere Else." That sounds like an Oscar-winning movie to me.
Let's talk later.
And that was about this vast fragility.
Well, that's this biosphere. This is probably the strangest shape in the universe. Just this little band of life circling the Earth, and very thin from top to bottom. And yet, as far as we know, that's where all life in the universe is concentrated. And we happen to be here. Well, lucky us, and it needs looking after.
That's it. That's the appropriate word. It's we that, as you mentioned, when you're out on a rocket, out in outer space, and looking at the Earth and seeing this biosphere and seeing how fragile it is, how sensitive it is, and then you put us back in the equation. It's not ours, it's we. So as soon as the mindset of human beings that we share the planet, it's not all about us, then I think that's a major step forward for understanding how to do the right thing and help this problem.
This seems to happen to a lot of the astronauts. They look back and they feel like their life has been changed from that point on. They call it the overview effect. We may not get up there with them, so we have to cultivate the underview effect of feeling it from the inside rather than looking back at it from the outside. But that's quite possible to do too. And so many people are just beginning to do something. The end of the book, the beginning of the book, I talk about the fact that because we're losing so much that we value, we've had to coin this horrible new word, endling, meaning the very last of its species, like Lonesome George, the last giant Pinta Island tortoise in the Galapagos, who died about 10 years ago at the age of maybe 101. Solitario Jorge, Lonesome George. At the same time, bird watchers have this, birders have this phrase, spark bird, meaning at some point in their life, they hadn't really been paying much attention, and some bird, some species called out to them insistently and said, look at me, look at my amazingness. And that got them hooked and thereafter changed their life. Well, it doesn't have to be a bird, it can be anything. It could be the native plants. It could just be changing a tiny piece of your garden. It could be whatever inspires you, a beautiful view. I mean, look at the landscape of this township. One of the most stunning places there is. By itself, as part of the Highlands, as part of the Appalachians, as part of the continent, no matter what scale you're thinking of, it's astonishing and amazing and astounding and takes your breath away. So there are so many openings and so many ways to get started that almost anything you could think of is exactly what's needed.
And unfortunately, there isn't a 911 number. We have this short-term emergency, we don't dial 911. For this more important long-term one, we don't have a 911. But we do have some other fun numbers.
We could give you his home phone number.
And so for people, some people in the audience, 32123 is a climate action day. So that's coming up on, that's the 21st of March. So Pam Breeman, in the back there, she's the president of the Orange and Duchess Garden Club. The part of the Garden Club of America is very involved with that. So see Pam to ask about that. We have the climate action, what's it called? The
Climate Smart Committee Task Force.
Climate Smart Committee Task Force. Jim Hayes and Jay Rice got involved with that. That's something that both in the village and the town, hands-on, trying to do the right thing and encourage people to empower people. April the 22nd is Earth Day. April the 28th is the Arbor Day, when we're planting trees in the village. So there's all sorts of things we can do. And like the quote you made from David.
Don't forget No Mow May.
And No Mow May as well is another great initiative.
And also, there's legislation that is in the works to make the month of April Native Plant Month.
Yay!
Federally, so write to your governor, write to Governor Hochul. We're trying to
That
get
is
all
pragmites.
50 governors to make it Native Plant Month, April.
And as Tony said, he quoted David Ehrenfeld's book, that we all need to become good ancestors. That's what, because it's a long-term project. It's for the next generations. What we do now is so important for the future. So
I just think it would be, we have about 10 minutes, and I think that would be a good time to open up the floor to questions. And why don't we just, so Jim, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think it's very important.
And speak as loud as possible.
I think it's very important. You've written this book, and like with the climate, though, there's an important urgency, and you mentioned that urgency, but things need to be done now. It's not something that can wait. And if you look at the rate of extinction that are happening at the moment, how quickly do you have to achieve what you're suggesting?
As soon as possible.
Well,
And
the human population is scheduled to peak out at maybe 10 billion. We're about 8 billion now. That's a 20% increase. And those people will need to be fed. You want to create contiguous open land, not little pieces, so that these carnivores that you mentioned, both cats and canines, can roam through. So how much of it has to be contiguous?
well,
What are we talking about in terms of the United States? 3/4 of the earth is covered with water, so I guess 3/4 of this half you're talking about will be the ocean. The rest will be on the continent. What do we have now that's open space? How much open space do we have?
well, less than 50% of the US is is developed. So we've got some breathing room that way. But it's not formally protected. The 3 R's of biodiversity seem to be retain what is still wild, reconnect places that have been severed from connection to make it possible for these corridors to do more than, as Christopher was saying, 1 + 1 + 1 = 4, and restore what has been diminished and lost. But within that context, whatever we do is better than not doing anything. So we have a little bit of time, yes. Even the Biden administration has taken the goal of 30 by 30. Their program is called America the Beautiful, even though the US is one of the 2 countries in the world that's not part of this coalition on biodiversity, the other being Vatican City, which I think is less than an acre in size. Although Pope Francis has been a huge backer of biodiversity protection, to his great credit. But even though we're not formally a part of it, we have this program. 2 states now have 30 by 30 programs. California, Governor Newsom set one in action. The New York State Legislature just last year passed a 30 by 30 plan. And I've invited, for instance, up to the Buffalo area at the end of May, where a land trust up there wants to reconnect the forests of the 8 westernmost counties of New York State. So this is something I hope Governor Hochul will conceive as a huge win for her, because all it does, we start with what's easily doable. The fact that this town has 79% open space, and almost none of it is federal open space. Unlike the West, it's all state protected land.
But it's miserable farmland.
And it's miserable farmland, which is a good reason. Well, it's got
Lucky us.
rocky hills, steep slopes, rock outcroppings, stunning landscape.
I actually had a question that hovered over my entire reading of your book, and it comes under the rubric of perfect is the enemy of good. What are your metrics for what gets into 30 or 50%, the good 30 or 50%? Because there's a lot of land that I'm sure is kind of in between. For instance, to take a local, for instance, I'm thinking about Warwick, up over the hill that way. There's a lot of farmland and a lot of open land. Does the farmland that where they're growing our onions and whatever that is that in the good 30, or is it the not good 30? How do you make judgments about things like this?
Well, a lot of farmland is in the need to be better category, because we've concentrated so much on growing single crops and stuffing the land with fertilizer and pesticides. We have to be able to grow crops in a way that is more respectful of what would be there if we weren't growing crops. A regenerative agriculture, it's called. So that's one challenge. But the point is, almost any place has got something that wants to be there. Can we add our uses in a way that doesn't just obliterate them? We've never really quite thought of it that way. This is what, as I said, we try to think of as all species design. Can we, a generation ago, the concept of universal design came to the forefront, which was the idea of building human structures that were welcoming to people with physical disabilities. And that's been a wonderful, wonderful movement, thanks to the American with Disabilities Act. Now, what about Species with Disability Act? We're not going to have that kind of legislation, but we can have that kind of mindset as we move forward.
Any other questions out there?
Yes,
Tony.
What do you think are some of the obstacles to promoting that mindset? We
You
have
know-
to adopt this mindset, but
We've got,
there's a lot of people who haven't adopted that mindset, I think. probably,
we've grown up without it, and we've been told by our culture for thousands of years. The world is there for the taking. It's waiting for us to make it into something useful and good. Let's invent things out of it. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But how do you do it in a way that isn't just be fruitful and multiply, but is also be respectful and multiply? And there's a lot of built-in thinking, you know, it's theirs, but it's ours for the taking, or it exists only in its potential to become something that we can make a lot of money out of. I think of that, it's not that way of thinking is wrong or evil, it's just that it's short-sighted. It's almost sort of a learning disability, if you take the longer point of view being, as we're saying, the survival of everything.
Yeah, I think do re mi. I think that's the barrier, the short term. And you know, when somebody needs to survive and put food on the table, thinking about the grander context is not such a priority. It's so for those of us that are successful in this domain, it's we need to empower others. We need to do our own little bit, continue and like has Tony done in his excellent book, filled with anecdotes of what was the aha moment for other people, what made them give away millions of dollars to help this cause. That's what we need to find, our own little thing that makes you feel proud. And that you know, when we leave this world, it's like being a house guest, that you don't leave the house trashed. If you're invited someone's home, you leave it hopefully in a better shape and with a beautiful gift that you've left your mark, instead of just raping and pillaging it. So that's our responsibility.
One of the purposes of the book is to try and bring us all up to speed on this, since we are in this strange 7-year decade. At least in terms of the goal we've set. Yes, you had a question.
Sir,
I'm in the process of building a new house, as Christopher Jow and other people know, in the village here. One of the things I'm trying to do is build a net zero house. What I would like to see happen, we pass a lot of legislation and rules within the village as to what you do when you're building and so on. States like California already require, if you're building a new building, you have to be able to build it net zero. I would like that to happen here.
what do you mean by net zero and what's in define?
No fossil fuels being burned.
Okay,
Produce your own electricity to be used on your own site. Okay, and if possible, not to spoil the land in the process. Keep as much greenery as possible. Do not plant lawns. Do not put grass seeds in the village. Plant local plants only. If you want to plant grass that grows naturally. Not the same thing that Christopher did in the raceway. He didn't plant fescue grass there. You've got beautiful long grasses growing. This is what I think we can do as a community. But somebody had to start it. And I think.
Well, you have, and we're thrilled.
Start on it, but I'll tell you, it is not inexpensive. You do have to dedicate a lot of the resources that you would put into a fancy house into putting in these extra structures, to be able to have this happen. So I'm very delighted to be here and hear this talk. This is right up exactly what I'm trying to do as an individual, but obviously we're a part of a community. And I would urge the neighbors to do some of the things that we're doing. For example, geothermal heating and cooling. You can build your fields just the same way that I did. We can drill into this ground, and it's filled with free energy. Once you tap it, you can get it. And my system is going to be guaranteed for 50 years.
We're so grateful. You are setting a great example here in Tuxedo Village of exactly that. And so hopefully that'll be an inspiration. It's a difficult thing, for example, with the solar panels, because we're such a historic community. So we're hoping, we're praying that Tesla comes up with, or other companies with fabulous solar panels that are
Looks like tiles.
look like tiles, yeah. But and so it's a great, and we're so grateful that you've taken this challenge and
To me, though, it's from the standpoint of, I'm a biologist by trade. It's arrogance on the part of our species to think that we should always do everything for our benefit. For example, every roof should have solar panels, even if it's a historic building, including churches, the Vatican, wherever. You go to Europe, you see solar panels all over the place. But we're so far behind in this country because we have that concept of the individual. The individual in America is the most important thing. We're all individuals. We have individual rights, but you have responsibility to everybody else. Your individuality ends at the tip of your nose, and your responsibility to everybody else extends beyond that, which is a lot bigger, hopefully, than your nose.
exactly, no, you're exactly right. Yeah.
So
Hallelujah.
that can of worms being opened, I think this might be a good place to stop. I think
More
so
of
we're,
more of a feast than a candid,
Yeah.
I would say.
maybe you can talk about this after. But anyway, we're so grateful to you, Tony, for coming up here and opening our minds, I think, is
Well,
what,
it's such a pleasure to be with.
so nice round of applause.